Under Charleston's magnolias, where lantern light gilds whispered sins, a lady's name is sold like currency. Lydia Pembroke stands at the edge of society's grace, her father's scandal fresh, her future shrinking to a single breath, while in the shadows, a powerful Earl watches with unreadable eyes. A black sealed letter will shatter the night, a proposal without tenderness, an alliance forged in necessity. But behind the velvet drapes lies a secret that refuses to stay buried, a past ready to claim the present, and an impossible choice between duty and desire. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and what do you love most about historical romances? The grand ballrooms, the forbidden glances, or the fierce, hard-won endings? Charleston, South Carolina, spring of 1850. The garden had been a triumph once, an Eden of white magnolias and sunlit gravel paths. Now, the perfume of the blooms mingled with the stench of whispered cruelty. Lydia Pembroke stood beneath the shade of a drooping dogwood, the lace of her pale bonnet catching a breath of wind as she tightened her gloved hands around the handle of her parasol. Her gown, muslin blue as a faded sky, had been carefully mended that morning. The hem bore the memory of better days, its trim dulled by time, yet she held her spine straight with the proud stillness of a woman who refused to wilt, even as the heat pressed against her like accusation. She was not meant to be here, not anymore. The Ballantine spring gathering had once welcomed her with music and laughter. She had danced beneath the paper lanterns hung from the oaks, courted by Charleston's most promising sons, her name whispered with admiration. But today, her presence drew a different kind of whisper. "Is that Miss Pembroke?" murmured one lady near the lemonade table, fanning herself as if repelling a scandal. "The ruined Miss Pembroke," came the reply, thick with sugar and venom. "After her father's affairs, I heard she offered herself to a merchant to settle the debt. No dowry, no name, no virtue left. What's left for her to sell but her pride?" Lydia turned slowly, her hazel eyes flecked with gold, locked onto the women. Neither flinched, neither apologized. They simply looked through her, the way one might inspect a cracked porcelain vase, once fine, now fit only for gossip. She felt her breath catch in her throat. It was not the lies that wounded, but the ease with which they were spoken. A month ago, they would have kissed her cheek. She pivoted, chin high, and walked toward the back edge of the garden, where the noise of idle judgment softened into the hum of bees and rustling hedges. The parasol trembled slightly in her grasp. She would not weep here, not before them, not as her mother once had, wilting into silence when the Pembroke fortune first began to splinter. The shaded path led to the rear terrace of the Ballantine estate, and seated there, as if carved from dusk and shadow, was a man she did not recognize. He sat apart from the gathering, beneath an awning, one gloved hand resting on an ebony cane whose silver handle caught the light. His dark frock coat was impeccably cut, though he wore no summer waistcoat, and his collar sat perfectly still despite the breeze. He sipped brandy from a crystal glass, unmoved by the chatter or music. His presence did not blend with the frivolity of the event, it loomed. Their eyes met. His were a shade she could not name, grey perhaps, but clouded with something deeper, not pity, not curiosity, something colder, sharper. He watched her as one might study the edge of a blade. She should have looked away, but her body betrayed her. She held his gaze, and a chill crept along her spine despite the spring heat. She turned before she could think. Her steps quickened, her heart hammering. She knew nothing of him, yet she felt the weight of having been seen, not merely observed. The moment passed, but its echo lingered. Later that afternoon she arrived, unannounced and uninvited, at her cousin's townhouse near the harbour. She had tied her bonnet tighter, covered her hands with fresh gloves, and carried herself with dignity, though the soles of her shoes were nearly worn through. He received her in the drawing room, flanked by his wife, both perched on crimson upholstery with expressions of pious discomfort. Lydia made her request simply, an introduction to a friend of theirs, a merchant recently widowed, who was said to be seeking a wife with refined manners. Her cousin's lips thinned. His wife refused to meet her gaze. "Lydia," he said, "you cannot imagine what you ask." "I ask only for your help in arranging a meeting," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Your presence at his table would harm more than help. Your reputation was taken from me, not by me." He flinched, but not enough. "My name may be Ash," she whispered, rising, "but it was built with the same stone as yours." She did not cry when she left them. She did not let the tears come as she descended the steps alone, nor when a passing coachman glanced at her with disinterest. Only when she reached the quiet edge of Rutledge Street, where the magnolias gave way to narrow alleys and the city's scent of salt and smoke, did she allow herself one breath that broke. She was 26, and the world had labelled her finished. Across town, the drawing room of Blackwell Hall sat in near darkness. Earl Jameson Blackwell stood before the fireplace, the orange glow reflecting off the silver in his temples. The letter from England still rested on the table. Another demand, another whisper of Grace's family clawing at the past. But it was not that letter he answered tonight. He dipped his pen into ink, his posture immaculate. He did not sit, he did not rush. The parchment bore only one line, written in deliberate strokes. "Summon Miss Pembroke. I have a proposal." He folded the note, pressed it with the wax seal carved in the shape of a wolf's head, and handed it silently to Miss Thorne. She did not ask. As the candlelight flickered across his unreadable expression, the Earl turned once more toward the hearth, watching the flames, as though seeking an answer in the fire. In the silence, the game had begun. But no one, not Lydia, not Jameson, yet understood the cost of what had been set in motion. Not all auctions end with gold. Some end with hearts. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the parlor with a softness that belied the tension gathering inside the Pembroke home. A breeze drifted in from the harbor, lifting the scent of salt and magnolia into the air, but it did little to soothe the unease simmering beneath the surface. Lydia stood at the window, her hands clasped loosely before her, watching the dusty road beyond the front gate. Her pale blue muslin gown, the same one she had worn at the Ballantine gathering, had been carefully pressed. She had fastened her mother's gold locket around her neck, the chain delicate against her collarbone. Her chestnut hair, coiled into a low chignon, revealed the graceful line of her neck, but her posture was tense, her shoulders drawn, her breath shallow. Her aunt, Mrs. Arabella Green, bustled in with a tray of tea that no one had asked for. The clinking of porcelain was louder than necessary, her lips pursed with a permanent tremor of disapproval. "He is an Englishman, Lydia," she said for the third time. "And not just any Englishman. A widower. A man whispered about in parlors and newspapers. His wife died under uncertain circumstances." Lydia turned slowly. "I did not invite him." "Nevertheless," her aunt snapped, setting down the tray with too much force, "he is coming to this house with intentions neither I nor society fully comprehend." Lydia gave no reply. She returned her gaze to the window, though the image outside had become a blur. She had received the note just after sunrise, hand-delivered by a silent footman bearing the seal of Blackwell Hall. It contained no greeting, no pretense of civility, just one line written in firm black ink. "I will call at 10. Prepare to receive me." And now, as the hour approached, the Pembroke house, which once echoed with laughter and servants' footsteps, felt like a mausoleum dressed in fading elegance. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The rug beneath her feet had dulled with time, and only the grand mirror above the fireplace remained defiant in its beauty. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of hooves struck the cobblestone. Lydia's breath caught as the black carriage appeared at the gate. It was imposing and foreign, the kind of conveyance that did not belong in a street lined with fading fortunes. The driver, stiff and expressionless, wore gloves so white they seemed carved from marble. Earl Jameson Blackwell descended without assistance. He wore a dark wool frock coat despite the warmth, and a cream waistcoat buttoned with polished onyx. His gloved hands rested casually at his sides, though nothing about him suggested ease. His posture, his stride, his unreadable expression, everything about the man declared authority. Danger too, but not the loud kind. His was the quiet threat of a locked room, a whispered secret, a sealed letter. Mrs. Green inhaled sharply. "He's younger than I expected." "He's not old," Lydia replied softly. "He's 38. Her aunt's head whipped toward her. "How do you know that?" But Lydia didn't answer. The butler opened the door with an awkward bow, and the Earl stepped inside as though the house belonged to him. "Lady Pembroke," he said, his voice smooth and clipped, carrying the faint trace of England across each syllable. His grey-blue eyes moved over her slowly, not in rudeness, but as if measuring her strength. "And Mrs. Green," she curtsied. He bowed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with the simplest of gestures, he indicated the sitting room. Lydia led him in. The room felt smaller now, the air too still. Lydia sat across from him, her hands resting gently in her lap, her spine straight. The Earl remained standing. "I will be direct," he said, his gaze fixed on hers. "I require a wife." Her fingers tightened, but her face betrayed nothing. "I have taken residence at Blackwell Hall," he continued, "and intend to expand my interests here. A southern wife with social standing, however altered, would serve a strategic purpose. You are of good family, though misfortune has tarnished your name. I do not consider that a defect." Lydia's breath turned to ice in her lungs. She heard each word like the striking of a match. "You propose marriage," she said finally, her voice low, measured. "Not affection, not companionship, but strategy." "Yes," he replied. "And you assume I would agree?" He did not blink. "I assume you are intelligent enough to recognize the opportunity." Lydia rose slowly, the full weight of her dignity encasing her like armor. "I may be ruined in the eyes of Charleston, my lord," she said, her voice trembling with fury, "but I am not a ledger entry. I will not be bought to enhance your portfolio." He said nothing, not immediately. Then, "I do not offer coin, I offer protection." From behind the parlor door, Arabella stifled a gasp. Lydia's eyes flared. "You think I require saving?" "I think," he said, taking a step closer, "you will soon find that you do." And then he bowed, more deeply than necessary, and walked out without waiting for a reply. The room felt colder when he left. The echo of his boots against the marble floor lingered like thunder long after the storm had passed. Arabella entered a moment later, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "What did he say?" she demanded. "What did you say?" Lydia shook her head. "He offered a cage disguised as a favor." Her aunt looked toward the door, as if still expecting the Earl's presence to reappear like a phantom. "You may want to consider that cage, my dear," she said with quiet urgency. "It may be the only shelter left." Lydia did not respond. She walked to the window again, watching as the carriage disappeared down the street. That evening, while the oil lamps were being lit and supper remained untouched, a letter arrived for Mrs. Green. She paled as she read it, her mouth tightening until it disappeared into a thin, grim line. "What is it?" Lydia asked. Arabella hesitated. "It's from the bank. The Pembroke estate, what remained of it, was to be seized within the fortnight. Debts had matured. The creditor, a man named Mr. Dalton Rhodes, was prepared to take possession unless immediate repayment was made, and he had requested a private meeting with Lydia." Lydia closed her eyes. She remembered Dalton Rhodes from her father's business dinners. He was once merely unsettling. Now, the thought of being alone in a room with him made her blood run cold. Arabella set down the letter with trembling hands. "Perhaps the Earl understood more than we gave him credit for." Lydia said nothing. She rose, walked to the mantel, and traced her fingers across the edge of the mirror, one of the few things untouched by the decay around them. Her own reflection met her gaze. There was no blush left in her cheeks, no softness in her expression, only a woman surrounded by crumbling plaster and candle smoke. and a man she barely knew had offered to put a lock around her life. Yet in that moment, she could not say which fate terrified her more, being his wife, or being no one at all. The rain did not fall, it punished. It lashed against the cobblestones like judgment from the heavens, drowning the gaslights in blurred halos of gold. Thunder cracked across the sky in violent declarations, as if echoing the turmoil within Lydia Pembroke's chest. Her carriage had long since vanished into the shadows, the driver eager to be free of the storm and the silence that clung to his passenger. Now, drenched and alone, Lydia stood before the towering gates of Blackwell Hall, her bonnet heavy with water, her gloved hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what she was about to do. The estate loomed like a spectre carved from slate and firelight. Its tall windows, shuttered and dim, offered no warmth. Only the faint flicker of candles behind thick velvet curtains hinted at life within. The iron gate groaned as it opened before her, automatically without a word, and the path stretched ahead like a sentence already passed. Lydia walked. Her soaked skirts clung to her legs. Her boots squelched in the gravel, and the rain traced cold fingers down the back of her neck. But her chin remained lifted, her spine unbowed. If she was to sell her name, her future, her heart, then she would do so standing. A butler in dark livery opened the door before she could knock. He neither welcomed her nor offered a word. Only a nod and a sweeping gesture toward the marble foyer where shadows danced with candlelight. The air inside was warm but oppressive, scented with aged wood, oil and something metallic, like the echo of old sorrow. Lydia's entrance left a trail of rainwater behind her, yet no one moved to wipe it. She was led to a room just off the great hall, a drawing room not of comfort, but of power. Heavy curtains shut out the storm. A single lamp glowed on a mahogany desk beside a decanter of dark amber liquor and 2 empty glasses. There, waiting in perfect stillness, stood Earl Jameson Blackwell. He did not startle at the sight of her soaked figure. He made no move to assist, no attempt at false courtesy. He simply observed her, as one might a painting just revealed from beneath a cloth. "You came," he said, his voice as calm as ever, cool, clipped, impossibly steady amid the storm. "I had little choice," Lydia replied, her voice hoarse from wind and pride. He stepped forward, his boots silent on the rug. "Choice is an illusion, Miss Pembroke, but your courage is not." She said nothing, her eyes fixed on him. Jameson studied her a moment longer before gesturing to the desk, where a stack of papers lay neatly arranged beside a quill. "The registrar is waiting in the next room. We will sign the documents in his presence. The ceremony will be private, legal, and swift." Lydia did not sit. "No vows?" He raised an eyebrow. "Do you desire them?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. What vows could exist between strangers who trafficked in necessity and shadows? "No," she whispered. "I do not." He inclined his head, neither smug nor sympathetic. "Good. This arrangement will protect us both. Do not mistake it for affection." Her heart flinched, not at the words themselves, but at the effortless cruelty with which he spoke them. As if love were a language he had once known, but had long since burned from his tongue. A woman entered then, older, austere, dressed in black. Her presence announced without words that she was the registrar. Behind her, a silent man brought in the leather-bound registry. He opened it, dipped the quill, and stood beside the desk like an undertaker waiting for a signature. Lydia approached. Her gloves were damp, nearly useless. She removed them slowly, revealing hands that trembled more than she wished. As she signed her name, Lydia Clarice Pembroke, a droplet of water slipped from her hairline and struck the parchment. The ink blurred slightly, like a tear refusing to fall alone. Jameson stepped forward next. His signature was bold, practiced, sharp. Jameson Alaric Blackwell. When it was done, the registrar offered a nod, closed the book, and disappeared as swiftly as she had come. No kiss, no prayer, no celebration, only silence and the sound of the storm clawing at the windows. Lydia remained standing by the hearth, her back rigid, her hands now bare and cold. Jameson poured a glass of brandy, but made no move to offer it to her. Instead, his gaze drifted not to her face, but to her throat. The locket. Her mother's locket rested against the damp muslin of her bodice, glinting in the firelight. It was a simple thing, gold, oval-shaped, no bigger than a coin, but it held her final memory of warmth, of laughter, of a time when she had been someone other than a transaction. Jameson's eyes lingered. "What is inside?" he asked, not with curiosity, but something else, something far more dangerous. Recognition. Lydia's fingers curled instinctively around it, a portrait and a scrap of my mother's wedding veil. His expression faltered, just for a breath. A crack in the marble. "I had a mother," he murmured, almost absently. "She wore pearls. I never knew if they were real." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if regretting his words, he stepped back and composed himself. "Miss Thorne will show you to your chambers. You'll be expected at supper. After that, we will discuss the parameters of this arrangement." Lydia nodded once. "Of course, my lord." But as she turned to follow the silent housekeeper who now stood in the doorway, she paused. "My name," she said quietly, "is Lady Blackwell now." Jameson did not look at her. "Names," he said, pouring another glass, "are as changeable as fortunes." She said nothing more. The walk to her chambers was long, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. The corridors were silent, save for the distant roar of thunder and the muffled sound of wind pressing against the great stone walls. Her skirts left wet prints along the polished floor. Her fingers still clutched the locket. When Miss Thorne opened the door to her new quarters, Lydia stepped inside and stood still, observing the space. A four-poster bed draped in damask, a marble hearth already lit, and a tall mirror facing the window. She removed her bonnet with slow precision. Water dripped onto the floor. She did not weep. Instead, she walked to the mirror and looked at herself. Her cheeks were pale, her lips slightly parted. Her eyes, those proud, hazel eyes, held no triumph, no resignation, only reckoning. She had married a man whose heart was stone. She had traded one prison for another, but even in that silent chamber, with the storm raging and her soul aching, Lydia knew one thing for certain. She had not surrendered. Not yet. The sun never seemed to touch Blackwell Hall in quite the same way it did the rest of Charleston. While the city beyond brimmed with the warm perfumes of summer, jasmine climbing brick walls, heat shimmering off cobblestones, this house remained still, shadowed, like it breathed from deeper lungs. It was not dark, not in the literal sense. Candles were always lit, hearths always tended, but there was something in the air, a stillness that held no peace. The manor was vast, with high ceilings and corridors so long they seemed to echo with memories rather than footsteps. The windows were tall, yes, but the velvet drapes were always half-drawn, filtering light as if too much of it might disturb whatever had long since settled into the bones of the place. Lady Lydia Blackwell awoke on her third morning beneath its roof to the gentle rustle of fabric and the scent of tea steeping nearby. Miss Thorne, the housekeeper, stood at the foot of the bed, composed as ever in her grey uniform and dark shawl. Her iron-grey hair was tightly bound, her lips thinner than a secret. "Good morning, my lady," she said with practiced formality. "Your bath is drawn. Breakfast is served in the solarium." Lydia sat up slowly. She had slept in a bed far too large for one person, the damask coverlet still smooth on the side she hadn't touched. Her mother's locket remained around her neck, as it had each night since her arrival. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still tender from silence. Miss Thorne's sharp gaze softened for a fleeting moment. "If I may, my lady, avoid the West Wing. It's not prepared to receive anyone." Lydia blinked. "The West Wing?" Miss Thorne inclined her head. "It's under repairs." And with that, she disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, her steps as silent as breath. Lydia bathed, dressed in pale morning muslin, and descended the grand staircase, her fingers trailing along the polished banister. The manor unfolded before her like a stage set without actors. Staff moved quickly, efficiently, but none of them spoke. They dipped their heads respectfully, but their eyes were trained on the floor. The solarium was a glass-walled chamber facing the southern gardens. Jameson was not there. She sat alone at the whitewashed table, the porcelain tea set untouched, the fruit arranged in perfect spirals, as though prepared for guests who never arrived. A footman poured her tea and vanished. She ate in silence, the only sound the distant ticking of a long-case clock. Occasionally, her gaze drifted to the corridor leading west, the forbidden wing, but she said nothing. Not yet. That afternoon, she explored. It was not defiance. It was necessity. The hours stretched like thread between her fingers, and the silence of the house had begun to press against her mind like a shroud. She walked the halls with measured grace, her skirts brushing marble floors, the soft tap of her heels the only sound she made. She studied the paintings, hunting portraits, family crests, landscapes of moors she had never seen, but there were no portraits of women, not a mother, not a sister, not a wife. The absence was louder than words. When evening came, she dined alone. Jameson did not appear, not a note, not a message. Just an empty chair at the head of the table and 2 crystal goblets filled with wine no one drank. Miss Thorne, ever present, offered no explanation. "My lord is attending matters at the south property," she said flatly, clearing Lydia's untouched plate. Later that night, the storm returned. Rain began in gentle taps against the windows, growing into fists against the panes. Thunder rolled like distant cannons across the plantation fields. Lydia stood in her chamber, watching the tempest, her reflection cast faintly in the glass. She had not removed her locket. She had not unpinned her hair. Sleep would not come easily tonight. The candle at her bedside flickered. The flame bent low, as if bowing to something unseen. And then she heard it. A sound. A door creaking. Not far. Her heartbeat slowed. Not quickened. Slowed, as though her body braced itself for what her mind had not yet accepted. She slipped into her slippers and crossed the hallway, the hem of her dressing gown whispering behind her. The corridor was dim, lined with portraits she had already memorized, but one door was open, just slightly, just enough, the west wing. Her hand hovered at the edge of the door. She pushed. The hallway beyond was colder, the air heavier. Dust clung to the corners of the floor. No candlelight had touched this place in days, maybe longer. She stepped inside. The walls were lined with empty frames, some covered with sheets. At the end of the corridor stood a single door, heavier than the rest, its handle tarnished with age. Lydia reached for it, her fingertips barely grazing the brass before a voice, deep, controlled, unmistakable. "There are rooms in this house that do not belong to you." She turned sharply. Jameson stood behind her in the dark, the storm illuminating his silhouette in brief flashes of silver lightning. His coat was damp, his hair uncombed, and yet he looked every bit the figure of command and power. "I heard a sound," she said, struggling to match his composure. "There are many sounds in this house. Not all should be followed." He stepped closer. The air between them shifted. She could smell rain on him, leather, and something darker, like cedar burning low. "Why is this wing sealed?" she asked. "Because it holds nothing you need." She narrowed her gaze. "That's not an answer." "No," he said quietly. "It is a boundary." He turned from her and opened the heavy door with a key pulled from his coat. The creak echoed through the corridor like the cry of an old wound. Lydia remained in place, uncertain whether to retreat or advance. Within the room, she saw only a few things before he stepped inside and blocked her view. A cabinet, a torn velvet chair, and a portrait propped against the far wall. It was only partially covered, but the face was visible. A woman with honey-colored hair and eyes that mirrored Jameson's. Lydia inhaled sharply. "Who is she?" His hand dropped to the edge of the cloth and pulled it down completely. The woman's expression was serene, beautiful, distant. "She was Grace," he said. The silence that followed was not empty, it was suffocating. "She was your wife?" "Yes." Lydia took a cautious step forward. "Why is she here? Alone? Forgotten?" Jameson's voice was low. "Because that is what she became." Before she could ask more, before she could utter the questions pounding against her throat, he turned once more toward the hall and said without looking back, "This room is not yours, Lady Blackwell, and it never will be." Then he closed the door, not with force, but with finality. Lydia stood in the darkened corridor, alone once more. But she had seen something, not just a portrait or a room shrouded in sorrow, but a fracture in the man himself, a wound still bleeding beneath layers of stone. And she knew, as she placed her hand against the cool wall beside her, that Blackwell Hall was more than a house. It was a mausoleum of memory, and she had just touched its heart. It was during supper, on a Thursday thick with humidity and fireflies, that Jameson announced his intention without preamble. "We will attend the harvest ball," he said, setting down his wine glass with calm finality. "You will be ready by 7. Lydia, seated across from him at the long dining table lit with soft candlelight, looked up from her untouched plate. The flame reflected off the silver in his hair and flickered in the storm grey of his eyes. Her fingers paused at the stem of her goblet. "The harvest ball," she repeated, her voice low but steady. "It is expected," he replied, "and I find usefulness in expectations." Her pulse quickened, though she was unsure if it was from the idea of returning to Charleston society or the way he said "we." "I have nothing to wear," she said, not as protest, but as fact. He glanced toward Miss Thorne, who stood near the sideboard as still and silent as an old portrait. At his nod, she spoke. "There is a gown in the attic, my lady. It once belonged to your mother." Lydia blinked. "My mother? Lady Pembroke commissioned it from Paris before your birth. Your father preserved it in cedar." The next morning, Lydia followed Miss Thorne through a narrow passage seldom used. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight as they climbed a back stair to the attic. The air was dry, scented with lavender and old wood. There, inside a preserved trunk lined with silk and secrets, lay the gown. It was soft ivory, with faint embroidery of gold thread along the bodice. The neckline was modest, the sleeves sheer. When Lydia touched it, something stirred within her chest. An ache not of grief, but of memory. Her mother's laughter echoed faintly in her mind. She had not heard it in years. That night the maids helped her dress. Her hair was gathered in a soft chignon, a few curls left to fall at her temples. She wore her mother's locket around her neck, resting like a heartbeat above her collarbone. She did not paint her lips or rouge her cheeks. She wanted the world to see her as she was, unvarnished, unyielding. Jameson met her in the entry hall, dressed in a black tailcoat with a silk cravat and gloves so pristine they almost glowed. When he saw her, he did not speak. His gaze moved from her eyes to the locket, then away. The carriage ride to Charleston passed in silence. At the entrance of the ballroom, everything stopped. The Harper residence was ablaze with lanterns, golden ribbons, and the laughter of Charleston's elite. Music poured from the open windows like perfume. Ladies floated in silks of every color. Gentlemen sipped brandy and boasted of crops and profits, and when Lydia entered on Jameson's arm, the world stilled, not out of courtesy, but from shock. All heads turned. Some women gasped behind fans. Some men whispered behind brandy glasses. Lydia felt their eyes on her like thorns against her skin. She straightened her posture, letting the weight of their judgment slide off her shoulders. The whispers came fast, sharp as blades. "Is that her? Lady Blackwell, the Pembroke girl. I heard she begged for the marriage. No dowry, no reputation, but she has him." Jameson said nothing. He led her through the crowd with measured steps, nodding only to those he deemed necessary. His hand rested lightly over hers, not possessive, not cold, just present. just enough to steady her. They were offered champagne, which Lydia declined. The music played on, elegant and distant. She had never felt more visible, nor more alone. A group of matrons hovered near a floral arrangement. "She wears her mother's gown," one said with a sneer. "How quaint! And that locket, like a desperate grasp at innocence." Lydia turned her head slightly, not to look, but to listen. Their voices were not hushed. They wanted her to hear. Across the ballroom, a group of younger noblemen laughed loudly, already deep into their second or third drink. One among them, Lord Edwin Carraway, the son of a judge and known for his cruel wit, staggered toward the punch bowl. His gaze landed on Lydia, his lips curled. "Well, if it isn't the newest ornament on Lord Blackwell's shelf," he drawled. Jameson stiffened. Lord Carraway stepped closer. "Tell me, Lady Blackwell, is it true he found you wandering the halls of your ruined estate like a ghost in search of a grave?" Lydia's breath caught, but she held her ground. Jameson moved forward, slowly, like a tide rising. "Apologize," he said, his voice low, cutting. Carraway scoffed. "To her." Jameson stepped closer, his eyes dark and deadly. "On the dance floor, in front of everyone, now!" Carraway hesitated. Jameson removed one glove with deliberate grace and held it between two fingers. "Or," he said with frightening calm, "you may receive this." The ballroom hushed. Lord Carraway paled. He looked around, searching for laughter that no longer came. He cleared his throat and stumbled toward the center of the floor. The orchestra, sensing something, fell silent. He turned to Lydia, bowed awkwardly, and muttered, "My apologies, Lady Blackwell." She inclined her head once, not out of forgiveness, but victory. The musicians began again. Without a word, Jameson offered her his hand. She hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers in his. They moved onto the floor. The waltz began. It was the first time they danced, not just as man and wife, but as something almost real. Lydia could feel the strength of his hand at her back, the tension in his shoulders, the quiet command in the way he guided her. But it was not just choreography. It was a conversation in motion. Their eyes met. She expected distance, but what she found was a kind of mourning, not for her, but for something within him, something buried deep and long silent. He said nothing, but she felt it, in the pressure of his fingers, in the brief pause before each turn, in the way his gaze lingered just a breath too long on the curve of her cheek. When the music ended, applause followed, some polite, some resentful. Jameson bowed. She curtsied, and just like that, it was over. They did not speak again until the carriage ride home. Neither of them looked at the other, but the silence between them was different now. Warmer, charged, not comfortable, but not cold. Later that night, Lydia returned to her chamber. She removed the gown slowly, folding it with reverence, then placed it back in its cedar box. The locket remained around her neck. She lit a single candle and approached the writing desk. There, slipped beneath her chamber door, lay an envelope, no seal. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. One line, written in a familiar hand. "I warned you once, Lydia, even ghosts have creditors." It was signed, Edward Pembroke, her father, long dead. And yet, the ink was fresh. The house held its breath. Since the night of the harvest ball, a hush had settled over Blackwell Hall, not silence but expectation. Footsteps were softer, doors creaked less. The wind barely stirred the drapes in Lydia's room. Even the hearth in the drawing room burned low, as if reluctant to cast light too widely. Lydia felt it in her bones. Something had changed. Jameson had spoken little since their return. He had left at dawn the morning after, his boots echoing through the marble corridor without explanation, without even a nod in her direction. He had not returned until well after midnight, and when he did, she had heard him pause outside her chamber door, just briefly, a moment long enough to wound. Then his footsteps had receded again, swallowed by the hall. But it was not only Jameson who seemed altered. That morning, when Lydia descended the east staircase to fetch a volume from the library, she noticed something she had never seen before. The west wing corridor, usually locked, shadowed, forbidden, stood slightly ajar. The key was no longer in the door. No lanterns flickered in that corridor. No staff dusted its paintings or polished its candelabras. It had become a place apart, sealed in its own mourning, until now. She glanced around. The butler was absent. Miss Thorne was nowhere to be seen. No maids swept the floors or passed with laundry baskets. A door left open at Blackwell Hall was not an accident. It was an invitation or a warning. Lydia stepped inside. The air shifted instantly, cooler, drier, scented faintly of lavender left too long in drawers. The corridor stretched ahead like a solemn procession. Its carpet faded. Its walls lined with portraits turned to face the wall. She moved, slowly, her slippered feet soundless on the floor, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. At the end of the hall stood the door she had seen before, the one she had been told never to touch. This time, it was unlatched. She hesitated, one hand pressed flat against the wood. Then she pushed. The chamber was dark, save for a single slit of sunlight cutting across the floorboards. Dust swirled in the beam, casting floating shadows like ghosts mid-sentence. She stepped inside. It was not a bedroom, as she had assumed. It was a private salon, a room of deep burgundy walls, velvet drapes, and gilt mirrors dulled by time. A faint perfume still lingered in the air, soft and floral and hauntingly familiar. To the right stood a writing desk. Its surface was cluttered with yellowed papers, dried ink pots, and a small stack of leather-bound journals tied with a faded silk ribbon. Lydia's hand hovered over them. She should not read them. They were not hers. They were the past. And the past, she had learned, could rot a person from within if invited to stay too long. But something compelled her. She untied the ribbon and opened the first journal. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, but hurried. The entries were not dated. Some were torn, others stained, yet they pulsed with emotion so raw, so intimate, that Lydia's breath caught in her throat. He does not know. He suspects, I think, the way he looks at me now, cold, measured. He touches my wrist, like one tests porcelain for cracks. I dreamed of the other man last night. I woke with his name in my mouth and guilt ringing in my ears. If they find out, it will be the end of us both. It's growing inside me, a truth I cannot carry. Lydia closed the journal with trembling fingers. This was Grace, the woman in the portrait, the wife Jameson had buried in the silence of this wing, the wife everyone whispered about, the wife Lydia had dared to envy once. She opened another entry. I loved them both. Is that possible? Is it love when it poisons everything? I fear the birth, not the pain, but what comes after. Whose eyes will the child wear? Lydia pressed a hand to her chest. Her own breath had become shallow. Her heart pulled between sympathy and a sharp, involuntary sense of betrayal. This woman had not been the victim Lydia had imagined, nor the villain society had painted. She had been torn, conflicted, and tragically alone. A soft creak behind her made her freeze. She turned. Jameson stood in the doorway, silent as a memory. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, burned with something ancient. Pain, anger, resignation. You left the door open, she said softly, unable to look away. I did, he replied. Why? Because it is time. He entered the room slowly, each step measured. He did not look at the journals. He looked only at her. You found them, he said, gesturing toward the desk. Lydia nodded. She was afraid. She was deceitful, he said without hesitation. Then, more quietly, but yes, she was also afraid. Of you? His jaw tensed. No, never of me. A long silence passed. She loved someone else, Lydia said, not as accusation but as truth. Jameson nodded once. She did. And the child? He turned away, his hand resting on the edge of the mantel where no fire had burned in years. Not mine. Lydia felt something close in her throat, a tension sharp and aching. Did you? She died in childbirth, he said, cutting her off, but not cruelly. The baby did not survive the night. He did not weep. His voice did not break. But something inside him shattered all the same. Lydia felt it. I buried them both, he continued, without ceremony, without comfort. And then I buried the name Blackwell, too. Lydia stepped forward, her voice a whisper. But you still carry it. He turned, meeting her gaze with startling intensity. Because I have nothing else. The air between them trembled. Not with attraction, not yet. With truth, with something real and raw and terribly human. I was a man who believed in order, in legacy, in discipline, he said. Grace was all fire and wildness. I married her because I thought I could tame her. She chose me because she thought I could save her. Neither of you were right, Lydia said, her voice softer than before. No, he replied, and we both paid for it. She didn't know what to say. There was no proper response to grief so tangled, betrayal so deep, silence so vast. So she said nothing, only placed the journals back in their bundle and tied the ribbon as gently as if binding a wound. That night, Lydia sat alone in the drawing room, the fire crackling in low embers. The air was warm, but her hands were cold. She stared into the flames, the locket around her neck, now heavier than it had ever felt before. She did not know if she pitied Jameson or feared him. She did not know what it meant that he had shown her that room, or what it cost him to speak the truth. But she knew with certainty that something had shifted between them. A door had opened, and it would not, could not, be closed again. The knock came just after dawn, sharp, urgent, splintering the quiet that hung over Blackwell Hall like a veil. Jameson had already risen. Lydia heard the swift cadence of his boots across the marble floor, followed by the low murmurs of voices too hushed to distinguish. She stood at the top of the staircase in her dressing gown, the early morning sun barely brushing the windows with light. Her heart beat in slow, deliberate thuds. Miss Thorne appeared at her side without sound, her hands folded over her apron. "What's happened?" Lydia asked, though she already knew. "Fire," the housekeeper replied. "At the South Plantation. It began in the storage barn sometime in the night. Casualties." Miss Thorne hesitated. "Not yet. But winds have shifted." Lydia turned without another word. By the time she reached her chamber, Jameson was already mounting his horse outside. A rider from the plantation stood nearby, breathless, mud-splattered, wild-eyed with panic. Lydia dressed quickly. No silks, no muslins, only a plain riding skirt, her oldest leather boots, and a linen blouse tucked into a brown wool vest. She pinned her hair tightly and draped a shawl over her shoulders. She left her gloves behind. She reached the courtyard just as Jameson was giving orders to the stable master. "You're not coming," he said without turning when he heard her steps. "I am." His tone was flint. "It is not a place for you." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Then it is not a place for any woman. Yet they are there, working, living, burning." He stared at her for one long, blistering moment, then exhaled through his nose and gestured to the work cart at the back. "You'll ride with Miss Thorne." They reached the plantation by mid-morning. The smell hit first, acrid smoke clinging to every tree branch, every thread of clothing. Then the sound, shouting, the rhythmic slap of water buckets, the shrill cries of frightened animals. Black smoke coiled into the sky like a warning from hell itself. The barn was half collapsed, flames licking at the splintered wood. A ring of men passed buckets in a frantic rhythm. Nearby, a cluster of tenant women and children stood huddled, faces streaked with ash. Lydia climbed down from the cart and did not wait for permission. She ran to the nearest woman, a young mother cradling a crying infant, and pressed a flask of water into her hands. Her shawl became a blanket for another child. Her sleeves, soaked and torn, wiped soot from cheeks that had not known comfort in weeks. Miss Thorne remained at her side, silent but steady, like an anchor in a sea of chaos. Between the haze of smoke, Lydia caught glimpses of Jameson, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, boots slick with mud, calling out orders with the command of a general and the urgency of a brother. And then a scream, a child's. Everyone froze, then movement exploded in every direction. "Tomas!" someone yelled. "He went back for the lambs!" Jameson was already running. Lydia followed, skirts bunched in her fists, lungs screaming for air. The barn groaned under its own weight. Fire snapped at the wooden beams like teeth. Without pause, Jameson plunged into the inferno. The world stopped breathing. Lydia reached the edge just in time to see him emerge moments later. Smoke blackened, eyes streaming, carrying a boy of no more than 7 in his arms. The child coughed violently, but he was alive. Jameson staggered forward, his left shoulder slumped unnaturally. He collapsed to his knees, shielding the boy with his body. Lydia knelt beside them, helping the child into Miss Thorne's arms. The boy's small hands clung to Jameson's soot-stained shirt before he was gently pulled away. And then Jameson sank back, clutching his shoulder with a sharp intake of breath. "It's dislocated," he muttered, grimacing. "Don't move," Lydia said. With the help of a field worker, they got him into the shade of a cypress tree. Lydia ripped a strip from her underskirt and soaked it with cool water from a nearby trough. Her hands trembled as she dabbed the sweat and soot from his forehead. The skin at his temple was singed. His cravat was gone. He watched her, not with suspicion, not with guarded silence, with gratitude, and something more dangerous, something aching. She examined his shoulder. "We'll need to set it. Have you done it before?" "No." She met his eyes. "But I've seen it done, and I've watched you suffer in silence too many times. I'll not watch again." He gave the smallest nod. Miss Thorne braced his back against the tree. Lydia gripped his arm with both hands, positioned her knee, and on the count of 3, pulled. The pop was sickening. He groaned through gritted teeth, sweat pouring down his neck. She steadied him with both arms as he breathed through the pain. Their foreheads nearly touched. Her breath fanned his cheek. His good hand brushed against her wrist. Just barely. Neither of them moved away. In that moment, there was no fire, no staff, no name, no history, only the scent of ash, the pounding of their hearts, and the unbearable nearness of the one person each had never intended to need. That night, as they rode back under a sky heavy with stars and lingering smoke, Lydia sat beside him in the cart. The lantern above them swayed with each bump in the road, casting shifting shadows across his face. He spoke first. "Your hands." They trembled. "I was afraid for you," she replied, not ashamed. He looked at her then, fully, deeply. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Was she kind to you, your mother?" Lydia turned her head to the open field, to the breeze brushing her cheek. "She taught me never to fear a storm," she whispered. Jameson's hand was resting on his thigh. She did not touch it, but their arms brushed once, lightly, as the cart rocked forward. Neither of them pulled away. And though no words passed between them the rest of the ride, the silence felt less like distance and more like the beginning of something unspoken. The first leaf fell with barely a sound. It twirled through the morning haze, brushing the glass of Lydia's chamber window like a quiet omen. Autumn had come early to Charleston, chasing away the heavy breath of summer and leaving in its place a strange, hushed stillness. The kind of stillness that preceded the unraveling of what had once felt certain. Lydia stood at the window in a deep green wool dress, her hair pinned in a simple twist. Her hands rested on the sill, the tips of her fingers cold from the breeze. Below, the ground stretched out in golden tones, fields preparing for harvest, trees beginning to rust, the pond still and reflective like glass. She heard the knock, but did not turn. Miss Thorne entered with her usual composure, carrying a letter sealed in blood-red wax. The crest stamped into it was unmistakable, a lion's head flanked by 2 laurels. It belonged to the Beresfords, Grace's family. For his lordship, the housekeeper said quietly, placing it on the writing desk. Did he see it? Lydia asked. He is in the stables. Lydia nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. That evening, she found Jameson in the library, a fire crackling behind him, and the Beresford letter opened on the table beside a crystal glass of untouched brandy. He sat in a low-backed leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, his expression carved from stone. Lydia had seen him wear many masks: control, defiance, detachment, but this one was different. This was the mask of a man staring into the past and finding no place to stand. They want you back, she said softly, stepping closer. He did not look up. They want the estate portion Grace claimed, a dispute over her mother's dowry and her uncle's will. If I don't appear, they'll drag it through every court in London. And while they're at it, he reached for the letter. They'll make sure to remind the world that Grace died in childbirth, married to a man who never produced a legitimate heir. Lydia's heart twisted. Do they know about the child? No, his voice lowered. But they suspect. And suspicion is currency in England. He stood abruptly, pacing toward the fire, the shadows leaping across his face. They threaten to expose you. They threaten to unearth what I buried. She studied him, his clenched jaw, the way his right hand flexed at his side as if still aching from the fire. And what will you do? He turned to her, meeting her gaze with cold finality. Whatever protects Blackwell Hall. She stepped closer, her voice a thread of breath. Even if it means going back to them, even if it means letting them name your truth before you can speak it? You think the world wants my truth, Lydia? He asked, a bitter edge in his voice. No, it wants my silence and my surrender. Lydia said nothing. That night, she dined alone. He did not come down. The next morning, a carriage arrived, but not for Jameson. Lydia was in the front parlour when the butler entered, a silver card tray in hand. "A Mr. Wycliffe, my lady. He asks for an audience." The name struck her like a memory she hadn't summoned in years. Thomas Wycliffe, once a quiet suitor, son of a modest merchant, thoughtful and eager, until her father's ruin had scattered every hopeful prospect to the wind. Lydia descended the steps with caution. Thomas stood in the drawing room, taller than she remembered, dressed in fine grey wool and gold cufflinks that gleamed like a statement. His hair was darker now, neatly combed, his eyes full of something between surprise and apology. "Lady Blackwell," he said, bowing, "you are even more beautiful than Charleston remembers." Lydia did not smile. "It's been a long time." "It has. But I heard about your marriage. And then I heard nothing. Not a word, not a whisper, until yesterday." He handed her a folded newspaper, English, printed in London. The headline chilled her blood. "Earl Blackwell faces legal challenge from late wife's family." Subhead, "Inheritance dispute reignites questions around Lady Grace's death." "I know men like him," Thomas said softly but with steel behind the words. "Powerful, cold, detached. You deserve better than to be caught in the middle of his ghosts." "I'm not caught," she said, voice sharp. He stepped forward. "Then why do your eyes look like they're begging to be seen?" The words struck something raw. Before she could answer, he reached into his coat and handed her a folded document. "I've opened a brokerage in Savannah. Cotton, trade, timber. I came back to Charleston for business, but I came to you for something else." Lydia unfolded the paper with unsteady hands. A deed, a new life, in her name. "You'd leave him?" she asked, barely audible. "You were never his to keep." He bowed once more. "Think about it, Lydia. No woman should have to live in the shadow of a dead wife." He left as quickly as he came. She remained frozen where she stood, the deed pressed to her chest, her thoughts louder than the ticking clock in the hall. That evening, she waited for Jameson in the study. The fire was lit. The Beresford letter still lay on the desk. She held the folded deed in one hand, the locket in the other. He entered at last, his coat still dusted from the road. "I know about the Beresfords," she said without preamble. He said nothing. "And I know what you carry in this house," she added, eyes burning. "But tell me, Jameson, do you still carry her ghost, or do you just use it to push me away?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was damning. Jameson didn't speak. He didn't rage. He simply stared at her for a long, shattering moment, then turned and walked away, without a word, without a glance, without her. That night, Lydia did not sleep. She sat by the fire until it burned low, the shadows flickering across the walls like questions without answers. Before dawn, she packed a small satchel, no gowns, no silks, no gloves, only a dress, a cloak, her mother's hand mirror, and not the locket. She left it on the vanity, its chain glinted like the echo of a love never spoken, and before the sun rose over Blackwell Hall, Lady Blackwell vanished into the fog. No carriage, no goodbye, no witness but the wind. The storm had arrived like judgment, sweeping through Charleston's cobbled streets with relentless fury. Lightning carved the sky into jagged truths, and the heavens groaned as if mourning something long buried. Rain lashed against the windows of Blackwell Hall, and the flames in the hearth sputtered with every gust, but Jameson did not notice the wind nor the thunder. He saw only the empty chair by the fire and the single damning object left behind on her pillow, the locket. Its satin ribbon lay curled like a question mark, and when he picked it up, something inside him buckled. He turned it over in his fingers, opened the tiny clasp, and there she was, Lydia, not in a miniature, but in memory, her eyes defiant and trembling, her voice steady when it should have broken, her courage, her silence, her absence. He bolted upright, rain soaking through his greatcoat before he reached the stables. No carriage would do. The roads were half mud, half shadow. He needed to ride to feel the wrath of the world as penance. And so he rode, through black wind and screaming branches, to the place he had once told himself he would never enter again. The Pembroke estate had not weathered time kindly. The shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the old family crest above the archway was cracked down the middle like a broken oath. He dismounted without grace, boots sinking into the soft, sodden earth. There was no gatekeeper, no staff, no light save for the flickering orange glow behind the parlor window. He pushed the door open, and it groaned like a wounded animal. Inside, dust swirled in the air like ash. Sheets covered furniture like mourning veils. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting golden light onto warped floorboards and faded wallpaper. And there, curled on a chaise lounge worn thin by years, was Lydia. She did not rise immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, her back straight despite the weariness that clung to her like damp linen. A small satchel lay at her feet, and beside it, a piece of parchment, the letter from her father, now curled at the edges from heat and time. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice low and unsteady. Jameson crossed the room slowly, each step echoing with more than just footfall. When he stood before her, he did not speak. He did not reason. He did not plead. He knelt. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto the floor. His hands, bruised from the rains, trembled where they rested on his thighs. He looked up at her, and in that moment, the power he had built his life upon crumbled at her feet. "I came to confess," he said. Lydia's lips parted, but no words came. She waited. "I did not kill Grace." His voice cracked like ice. "But I let her die alone. I watched the physician leave the room. I knew the child was not mine. I knew she had lied, again and again. And still, I did nothing to stop the end from coming." He bowed his head, as if the weight of his silence had finally broken his spine. "I buried them both with a cold heart, not because I hated her, but because I couldn't bear the shame. I could not hold a child that wasn't mine. I could not forgive her for turning our marriage into a transaction. so I folded into myself, and I locked every door." Lydia's breath trembled, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if to still her racing heart. "I did not want a wife," he went on, "not again. But then I saw you fighting the world with no armor but your pride. I thought, perhaps we could protect each other behind walls neither of us dared to breach. But I was wrong." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the locket. "You left this," he said, his voice quieter now, like the rain against the windows. She looked at it, then at him. "I couldn't keep it," she whispered. "It belonged to a woman who wasn't afraid to feel, who believed love was meant to be honest, even when painful. I am not her anymore." Jameson took her hand and placed the locket in her palm. "But you are," he said. "You are the only part of my life untouched by shame. You are not ruined. You are the storm I did not expect, and the calm I never earned, and I—" He paused, voice catching. "I cannot lose you. Not now. Not after everything." Lydia's eyes shimmered, but the tears did not fall. She turned her face away, staring at the fireplace with its flickering flame. "I came here to forget," she said, "to sit in the ashes of what I was before you, to burn the past." She reached for the letter beside her and handed it to him. The ink had smudged slightly from heat, but her father's signature remained clear at the bottom. She met Jameson's gaze. "I found this the night of the ball, slipped under my door, but he's been gone for months." And yet, there it was. Jameson studied it, his jaw tightening. "Someone wanted to unsettle you." "Yes, and they succeeded." Her voice shook. "I walked into that ballroom hoping to reclaim myself, but in the end I saw the truth, not in the eyes of those who judged me, but in yours. You were just as haunted." Jameson stood slowly. He reached for her, then hesitated. She noticed. "Why do you stop yourself?" she asked. He swallowed. "Because I don't know what I am without the distance, without the control, without the mask. But for you, I would take it off. Every day if you asked." For a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled, and the storm outside softened to a hush. Finally Lydia rose from the chaise. She stood before him, her hair unpinned, her dress travel-worn and wrinkled, and yet she had never looked more like a woman born to command a room. She opened her palm, the locket resting in its center. "If you want me," she said, voice firm but full of tremor, "it cannot be as a shield. It cannot be a marriage of protection or escape. I will not be hidden again." He stepped forward, placing his hand gently over hers. "Then come home," he said, "as the woman who lit the West Wing without a key, as the one who taught me that some ghosts deserve to be laid to rest." She did not smile, she did not cry, but she nodded, once like a vow. He held the door open for her, and together they stepped into the storm's fading light. Behind them, the fire burned low, casting shadows over the ruins of a past neither would return to again. Ahead of them, Charleston waited, its eyes still sharp, its tongue still cruel. But Lydia walked beside a man who had knelt for her, and Jameson walked beside the only person who had ever seen through his armor, and in her pocket the locket gleamed once more. The moon hung low over Charleston, its silver light bathing the rooftops in silence. Below, carriages clattered along the cobbled avenues toward a mansion ablaze with lanterns and music, the Radcliffe residence, host to the final ball of the season. Inside, the elite gathered beneath gilded ceilings and chandeliers, their whispers fluttering like lace fans behind gloved hands. And as the hour struck 9, the music paused, for all eyes turned toward the grand entrance. She stood at the top of the marble staircase, one hand resting lightly on the curved banister. Lydia Blackwell. Not the ruined debutante, not the whispered cautionary tale, not the girl abandoned by fortune and nearly swallowed by shame, but a woman. Her gown was a deep crimson velvet, rich and bold against her pale skin, with an off-the-shoulder neckline softened by delicate black Chantilly lace. A single diamond comb pinned her dark hair in a Grecian twist, and at her throat gleamed the locket, no longer hidden, no longer a relic of sorrow, but a badge of survival. She wore it like a seal, a symbol that her story would be written by no one but herself. The music resumed slowly, but the crowd remained still. Jameson stood at the bottom of the stairs, his black tailcoat and ivory waistcoat impeccable. Yet it was not his attire that drew notice. It was the transformation in his eyes. The guarded steel was gone. In its place, reverence. He offered his hand, not as a command, not as an obligation, but as a man humbled. For a moment, Lydia did not move. Her gaze scanned the crowd. Lady Pembroke, her aunt, stiff with disbelief, her former suitor, now bloated by money and ego, shifting uncomfortably near the champagne. The same matrons who once whispered behind gloves now pressed them to their lips in quiet awe. But Lydia's eyes returned to one face alone. She descended the stairs. Each step was a declaration, each rustle of her skirts a defiance. And when she reached him, she paused just long enough to make the world hold its breath. Then she placed her hand in his. The ballroom exhaled. Jameson bent his head, his lips near her ear. "Do you regret it?" he whispered. She met his gaze. "No, only the time we wasted." Their first dance was not choreographed perfection. They moved slowly, as if remembering how to be near one another in this new light. Her gloved hand in his palm at her waist, gently anchoring her. They spoke no words, but in every glance, every breathless pause, was the ache of what had been endured, and the promise of what might now begin. "Why did you come back?" she murmured. "I never left," he said. "Not truly, you carried me with you." Later that evening, as the music swelled and candles burned low, a murmur swept through the crowd again. Not scandal, not derision, but admiration. Respect. Some turned their backs out of habit, but others bowed as Lydia passed. And for the first time, she did not flinch from their gaze. When they stepped out onto the terrace, the winter breeze was sharp but bracing. Stars blinked above them, stubborn and clear. "I hated this city," Lydia confessed softly. "Not for what it did, but for how easily it watched. And now, I don't need it to see me anymore." Jameson turned to her, his voice quieter than the wind. "You said you came to burn the past, but I've learned some fires warm rather than destroy." She looked at him. "Do you love me, Jameson?" He didn't blink. "I did the moment you refused to beg. I did when you chose silence over surrender. But I didn't know how to love without fear. Not until you left. And now?" "Now," he said, taking her hand again. "I do not wish to claim you, Lydia. I wish to belong to you." Her throat tightened. She had expected an apology, a vow, a dramatic promise whispered into the night. But this was different. This was surrender. She leaned in and touched her lips to his, not as spectacle, not as ritual, but as absolution, and the world faded. They did not return to the ballroom. Instead, their carriage rolled slowly through the empty streets toward Blackwell Hall. Gas lamps flickered in the fog. Cypress trees swayed. The silence between them was not empty, but full of the weight of all they had endured, full of the quiet bravery of two people choosing each other at last. Inside the manor, the staff had retired, and only the embers in the drawing-room fireplace remained. But Jameson did not lead her there. He took her hand and brought her to the west wing. The corridor was no longer dark. The door, once locked, once forbidden, stood open. Within, the furniture was dusted, the curtains drawn back. A fire crackled in the hearth. The portrait of Grace had been removed. In its place hung a painting of the coast, where storm clouds met sunrise. Lydia entered slowly, as if stepping into memory. He watched her. This house has held too many ghosts. It's time it held something else. She turned to him. And what would that be? He stepped closer. Truth. And if you'll let it, love. She did not smile. Instead, she reached up and unclasped the locket, laying it gently on the mantel. I do not need it to remember her, or my mother, or who I was. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. And who are you now? He asked. She turned in his arms, her forehead resting against his. I am the woman you thought you could tame, but I was never meant for a cage. Nor I, he replied. They stood there, wrapped in warmth not only from the fire, but from the long-earned stillness that follows a storm. Outside, the wind had stilled. The past had been spoken, its ashes scattered. And in that room, lit by flame and silence, love, real, flawed, hard-won love, finally came to stay. The magnolias had bloomed early that year. Their creamy white petals crowned the gardens of Blackwell Hall like ghosts of springtimes past, perfuming the air with a scent so heady it made time feel like a soft dream. The sun filtered gently through moss-draped oaks, casting golden lace across the stone paths, and within the house the sounds of music and laughter echoed, not of polite soirees nor grand balls, but of simpler joys. A child's laughter. Lydia stood on the veranda, one hand resting against the column, the other holding a folded letter sealed in red wax. Her dark hair, now worn in a softer style, was pinned at the nape of her neck. The years had left their mark not in lines or weariness, but in the serenity of her gaze. She wore a soft grey dress, embroidered with ivory leaves at the cuffs and hem, a creation of her own design. Her once hidden talent for embroidery had become more than pastime. It had blossomed into a discreet but sought-after business, stitched into the hems of dresses worn by women far wealthier than she had once been. Inside the nursery, a boy of 3 years, with coal-black hair and storm-grey eyes, pulled at Miss Thorne's skirts. "No!" he declared, brandishing a wooden sword. "I'm not going to nap. I'm going to duel Papa." Lydia smiled and turned toward the staircase, just in time to see Jameson appear, his gait slower than it once had been, his shoulder still stiff on rainy days from the fire years ago. But his eyes, those same eyes once clouded with grief, now held only light as he scooped up his son and spun him around, eliciting a riot of giggles. "Do you challenge me, Lord Henry?" he asked in mock severity. The boy squealed with delight. "Yes, and I shall win." "You have your mother's defiance," Jameson muttered with affection, placing the child gently on his feet. "And your talent for disappearing when it's time for discipline," Lydia added, stepping forward. Jameson met her with a quiet kiss on her brow. Guilty. They walked together toward the West Wing, once forbidden, now filled with new life. There, above the mantel, hung not portraits of the past, but a watercolor of the Pembroke estate ruins, painted by Lydia herself. A ruin, yes, but touched by light and green vines, as if the land too had chosen to begin again. From London, another letter had arrived. The Marquess of Merrow, Grace's brother, once so determined to smear Jameson's name, had been disgraced in Parliament, caught embezzling funds meant for war widows. His titles were stripped, his allies gone. Lydia had not gloated. She simply placed the news aside, understanding now what it meant to let the past collapse under its own weight without lending it your breath. Of Lydia's former suitor, there was little news. He had married a Boston heiress whose dowry had tripled his wealth but not his happiness. He had written once, an apology masked in business prose, but Lydia had never answered. What would be the point? Lady Pembroke, her aunt, had eventually sent a timid letter after the birth of Henry. "The child deserves a proper upbringing," she had written. "Perhaps now you will allow civility between us." Lydia had replied with courtesy, and nothing more. Forgiveness did not require reunion. As twilight fell, Jameson and Lydia sat on the stone bench in the rose garden. 4 years. 4 hard-won, sun-dappled, storm-weathered years. "How strange," he murmured, brushing her fingers with his, "to think that I once thought this, us, impossible." She looked at him, her voice soft. "You thought love was a closed door. I thought I was ruined. We were both wrong. And if we could go back? I wouldn't change a thing," she said. "Even the hurt taught me what I would never again give away. My voice, my worth, my place." Jameson took her hand and placed it over his heart. "You saved me from myself, Lydia, not with kindness alone, but with steel. You never begged, you never flinched. I would have lived a life of shadows had you not burned your way in." Behind them, little Henry ran across the garden with a wooden sword raised, his boots muddy, his cheeks pink from the wind. Miss Thorne followed slowly, shaking her head but smiling all the while. "Let him run," Lydia said, watching her son with pride and wonder. "He was born from ashes, let him fly." And so he did, through gardens, through laughter, through the legacy of two people who had once stood at the edge of ruin and chose together to build something beautiful. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the lanterns flickered to life across the veranda, Lydia rested her head against Jameson's shoulder. Love had come, and it had stayed, not perfect, not painless, but honest, earned, and eternal. And so, dear listener, if you've come with us all the way to the end of Lydia and Jameson's journey, you've witnessed something rare, a love not born of perfection, but of courage. A story where wounds were not hidden, but healed, where reputation was shattered, but dignity remained intact, and where, in the quiet spaces between pain and forgiveness, two hearts found a home. This tale was never just about a ruined lady or a haunted Earl. It was about the strength to rise when everything crumbles, about reclaiming worth when the world has tried to strip it away, about second chances and having the bravery to take them. If this story moved you, touched you, or simply gave you a moment of peace, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what parts stayed with you, what made you feel, and if you made it all the way here to the end, write the word unruined in the comments below. That way we'll know you were truly part of this journey, and together we can help this story travel further, reaching hearts that need it most. If you wish to support the creators who pour their time and heart into bringing you these stories, you can leave a super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount feels right to you. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us keep the fire burning and the ink flowing. And if you're not able to give that way, simply sharing this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who believes in the power of love, that means the world to us too. And don't forget to explore more heart-stirring tales just like this one. We've linked them in the video cards for you. Thank you for walking these candlelit halls with us. May love, true, brave, imperfect love, always find you.